there's not potentially not as many pelagic operators as you'd expect for a pelagic bird country like New Zealand. Birding's still a relatively newish kind of hobby in New Zealand. So there are some. There's the most famous kind of public or company that does it is in Kaikoura, just north of Christchurch, and that's if there's an international bird who has only got time for one pelagic. That's often the one that is recommended. They do just a 2.5-hour trip, and even that's fantastic because they've got a really deep water canyon just off the coast, so it takes 10 minutes to get out there, and you're seeing 5 or 6 species of albatross, and you've got snow-covered mountains in the background. So that's pretty exciting.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Birding Today podcast, where birders come together to discuss the joy of birding. I'm your host, Guillaume Doerig. So, I want to jump straight into the episode today, because I like doing that. I like going straight to the content. So, I'll introduce today's guest, who is a 25-year-old birder from Christchurch, New Zealand, currently completing a master's at Lincoln University, GPS tracking Black-fronted Terns. He's also working part-time as an ornithologist for ecological consulting company Wildland Consultants, having previously worked as a guide on the west coast of the South Island and for New Zealand's Department of Conservation, EPIC. He has been interested in birds since he was 5 or 6 and has grown up birdwatching around New Zealand, recently becoming a keen lister and eBird enthusiast. So please welcome Fraser Gurney on the show. Thanks for your time, Fraser. I'm really excited, and especially because you're an international guest. I always love doing that. So how's it going?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me on. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to get into it.
Excellent. And I understand that because I contacted you, and you replied back saying, "Oh yeah, I'm actually a listener of the show and stuff." So that was really cool.
Yeah, it was a nice moment. Yeah.
Excellent. So what brings you joy about birding, Fraser? What is it about the passion that really draws you in, that brings you joy, would you say?
It's a good question. There's a few things, and the thing that immediately leaps to mind is no matter where you are or where you're birding, there's always a chance of seeing something exciting. You could be out on a pelagic and a mega seabird might be coming past, or you could just be in your backyard and a fantail shows up for the first time, and that's still really exciting. So wherever you are, there's always a chance of something really cool. So I really like that, seeing new things. It's getting really familiar with things that you see a lot. So even things like a boring old house sparrow or a dunnock can be really interesting when you sit and watch them for half an hour and you notice new things. So that's really cool as well. Yeah, but here in New Zealand, it's probably the same in Australia. It's a really good way just to get out and see the country as well. You end up in a lot of places where if you weren't, chasing a bird that had been seen there, you would never go down a side road or maybe not go into that little reserve out the way a bit. So that's really exciting too. But yeah, and I suppose it's hard to get away from the list building aspect as well, which is quite a satisfying and a nice way of measuring it. So yeah, there's lots of things that come to mind about the joy in birding.
Yeah, no, for sure. There's a lot to unpack, even with just that first concept of joy, and you mentioned pelagics, and as it happens, at time of recording, yesterday I was on a pelagic off Southwest Rocks, which is on the east coast of Australia, and man, it's just something else. It's absolutely amazing when pelagics are just. Oh, and it was a choppy sea with lots of rain, and we got some really good birds. Tahiti petrel was a highlight for me.
Oh wow!
Yeah, just beautiful, and that joy, and I was at the back of the boat, and I went on my knees like that, and just out on the side, and I just put my binoculars and my camera away for a second. I was just because they come so close. And I was just looking at the flesh-footed shearwaters and wedge-tailed shearwaters just frolicking by. Just such a joy, and it's difficult to pinpoint where that joy comes from, but it's just unmistakable, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you must get lots of pelagics. I mean, so So shifting also to your situation in New Zealand and your birding life in New Zealand, tell me about how you got into it. I understand that you got into it at like 5 or 6 years old. So how did that happen?
Yeah, there's not really a specific event I think I can point to which said, I'm a birder now, but um, my mum was a librarian when I was growing up, and she brought home a whole range of books um, on various things. And I think probably the nice bird books with the big colourful photos were pretty attractive to me at the time. So that probably had something to do with it. And my parents in general have a pretty good appreciation for nature. They're not birders per se, but no, where I'm in Christchurch, it's only an hour and a half up into the mountains. There's Kia an hour and a half from home. A really cool endemic mountain parrot we have here. So that's like a pretty exciting thing that will help get that interest going. And the other thing is, as a kid, I had I had the airplane phase. My dad used to take me to the airport to watch the planes landing, and had the dinosaur phase as well. And I suppose if you kind of cross a plane and a dinosaur, you get a bird. So that's kind of one way of looking at it.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's a good point. You mentioned that the different phases through childhood that you go through before discovering what you really love. You know, um, I also had a dinosaur. I had a dinosaur phase. I remember that. That was cool. I used to love watching the Walking with Dinosaurs documentary
Yeah,
BBC.
I watched that one as well. Yeah.
Just so epic. I still love it. And so, yeah, all this progression in life, and it's also dictated by where you live. And hopefully we can get into this a little bit later in the episode. But briefly tell us a little bit about New Zealand birding, maybe, and how it's maybe different from Australia and the rest of the world.
Yeah. So right off the bat, the first thing I'd say is that we've got lots of really cool endemic species here. So New Zealand's been kind of a landmass by itself for about 80 million years. So there's lots of endemic birds that have been evolving by themselves for ages. I think it's about 80% of our native birds are endemic, so quite high rates. And even among those birds, some of them are really weird and interesting. So you probably know of things like the kiwi, only bird with nostrils at the end of its beak, and the only alpine parrot, the kia, and the kakapo. So there's lots of very strange birds that are, as from an international perspective, that's what birders, and especially listers coming to New Zealand, are probably most interested in, is those funky species you can't get anywhere else. But yeah, you mentioned seabirds before. New Zealand's called the seabird capital of the world sometimes. So we've got lots of seabird species. I think it's upwards of 85, 86 species that breed here, and 13 albatross species that breed. So really, really high numbers. And yeah, as a result of that, a big part of birding in New Zealand is seabirding. So a lot of the kind of diversity in your list often comes from seabirds. And just recently, in the last year or so, storm chasing has kind of become a big thing for pelagic birding. So it's sea watching, but specifically when there's a big storm event going on. And last year there was a big southern front that came through, and me and a bunch of other birders had an Antarctic petrel fly past on the beach. We're halfway up the South Island, so a long way north for a species like that. A couple of others had a tropical cyclone up at the north of the North Island, and they had the first ever black-naped tern for New Zealand and the first live bridled tern. So lots of good stuff coming in with the storm fronts.
Yeah, wow, that's really cool. I'm really excited to discuss that a little bit later. And as you say, seabirds are kind of, you could also say, the epicenter of New Zealand birding. And you're involved in that. You're involved in the study of that, with specifically the black-fronted tern. Tell us about your work with that. Sounds awesome.
Yeah, so they're another one of our endemic birds, and they spend their winter at the coast and often out to sea, but they breed inland in riverbeds in the central South Island. And there's a really good program going on in New Zealand at the moment called Predator Free 2050, where we're aiming to get rid of all our rats, stoats, and possums. which is fantastic. But for things like black-fronted terns, it's not as great because they're more threatened by other things like feral cats and hedgehogs and things like that. So they're kind of on the lower not lower priority, but it comes across that way sometimes. And so they're a species that needs a bit of love. So I really enjoyed being involved with them. And I'm working with the Department of Conservation on this one, and they're really interested in their migration routes. So we know they breed in the inland and end up at the coast, but not really sure how they get there and how they get back and that kind of thing. So that's what Doc's really interested in.
Right. Yeah. And so, and that involves putting GPS kind of what would you call them, devices on the birds themselves.
Yeah. So that was my field work, which was really cool, getting to catch and handle these birds and putting wee GPS trackers. They're only about that big and they weigh a tiny amount, which is really exciting. It's the first time the species has ever been GPS tracked, so it's all kind of new information for science, which adds another layer of excitement to it.
But I suppose also another aspect of that is that it does take time to start to see trends and patterns, doesn't it, for things like this?
Yeah, so I started this not the most previous breeding season, but the one before. So and it's kind of, once my field work stopped, it's something that others have carried on. So mine was kind of just the initial push, and it's going to be an ongoing thing. So as you say, there can be trends and things detected.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the scientific aspect of birding is really fascinating as well, and the opportunity to get to work on something like that must be fantastic. Really cool. Wow.
Yeah, that is really exciting. My mum did advise me to, before I got into this kind of thing, maybe to keep, my passion for birding and my professional life separate. Maybe it's the way to go. But I'm really glad that I did go. Passion and work is the same thing.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point you touch on, Fraser, because and on the show we haven't talked about that quite a lot either. Because I've been told the same thing by various people, and I've even told myself that, like, if you go professional with it and it becomes your job, is that a good thing? Maybe not. And I suppose it depends on the personality and the personality of who you're talking about. But yeah, and so what made you decide to go to do that and to make it your job? Was it a particular? Were you so passionate about it that you couldn't do anything else? Is it something like that?
Yeah, I think so. It was after I finished high school, and I was thinking about doing a degree at university, and I was looking around, and the only thing that I got really excited about was a conservation degree, conservation science. So yeah, I think even if I'd maybe tried to keep them separate, it was probably inevitable that they wound up together. But yeah, as you say, it might work for some people to keep it separate, but other people say if you do what you love, you never work a day in your life. So there's the other way of looking at it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so many advantages as well come with that, because you're always immersed in what you love, which is great. But I'm sure that there are aspects that are a bit boring, like every job. But because you can't, there is no perfect job, or is there? Would you disagree?
Oh, I don't know. It might be a perfect job. Just with my masters, doing my thesis, doing the number crunching and the write up isn't quite as fun as the field work. But yeah, I don't know. I'm sure there is a bird job out there. I know some bird guides who think they have just the best gig in the world. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and that's what I meant just a few moments ago when I said there's the boring parts of a job. Like there's parts you don't enjoy as much, perhaps. Like you say, when you're maybe on the computer a lot or data crunching. Yeah, for sure. There's different aspects. And so I know that you also, apart from the Black-fronted Terns and the work you do with them, you also do ecological consulting. I was really curious to discuss that with you. So what does that involve? What's the day-to-day with that?
Yeah, so it's a nationwide New Zealand company, and I'm in the Christchurch kind of branch of that. And so I do a really wide range of things. So ecological restoration, predator control for introduced pests. They do a lot of consulting work, which is kind of like if there's someone putting in a new section of road, then wildlands will be hired to do a ecological survey to see what's there, and if the road goes ahead, what part of that ecosystem is going to be affected, and then what that company might need to do to offset those effects, and then they can be involved in any kind of mitigation works, which might be creating new habitat away from the road, or and it almost always invariably involves monitoring. So in New Zealand, that's lots of things, but often centres around birds. So lots of bird surveys, and that's what I've been doing recently is bird monitoring, and it ties in quite nicely with my masters because it's been braided river bird monitoring, looking for nesting birds in braided rivers in Canterbury. So that's a nice tie-in.
Yeah, wow. And it's interesting that you touch on the pests as well, which is a huge, very huge aspect of New Zealand, not only New Zealand birding, but New Zealand ecology, isn't it? It's probably, arguably in the whole world, it's where it's been the most devastating, I guess.
Yeah. New Zealand's, it's not a great record. We've got a huge number of extinct native birds. I'm not sure. There's not as many in Australia as things like paradise parrot over there, but we've got 11, 12 species of moa, various ducks, rails, snipe. There's far too many. It's quite depressing. I've recently got a big Lynx book, All the Birds of the World, which is an awesome book. But
I've got the same one over there. Yeah, I've got it.
Oh yeah, nice. Yeah, it's a great book, but it's a bit depressing in the back. It's got the extinct birds section, and every third or fourth bird's from New Zealand, which is quite a sobering thing.
Yeah, incredible. Yeah. Why do you think that is, that happened in New Zealand? What was it about New Zealand that made it so vulnerable? It was just the isolation, was it, from everywhere else?
Yeah, the isolation and the fact that there were almost no land mammals. So only land mammals at the moment are 2 species of bat. So birds and other wildlife evolved without mammals around. So when humans arrived and brought rats and cats and stoats and things with them, the birds were basically defenseless, and so these mammals have a great time eating these birds which don't know how to escape them, basically. So that's how our birds get so badly affected.
Yeah, it's incredible. It blows my mind that the only native mammals are 2 species of bats. That's absolutely mind-blowing, isn't it? Wow.
Yeah, and it even depends who you talk to, because one of our species of bat just won Bird of the Year, which was controversial in birding circles over here.
What? Really? Tell me about that.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Yeah, there's a voting poll which is taken very seriously every year for Bird of the Year, where you can select your 5 favourite birds, and the one that gets the most votes wins. And this year, for publicity for bats and that kind of thing, they entered a bat, and the bat ended up winning, and all the birders are wringing their hands, and how embarrassing.
Oh no, that's not good, is it? Oh, wow.
It's great for the bat, but yeah, not so great for the birds.
Oh wow, yeah. I mean, there's going back to what we were saying about the isolation and the fact that there are only 2 species of bats. That's incredible, and that also leads me on to the international appeal of New Zealand, which is, in a sense, the predators of New Zealand make the remaining native birds even more precious, And that's the appeal of, as you said, lots of international birders coming and wanting to list and not even that, but just to see the birds. And so you've been guiding people, I understand. You've guided international visitors to New Zealand. What was that like? What do international birders, when they come to New Zealand, how do they behave? Are they pretty set on specific species, or are they happy to kind of see what there is?
Yeah, so I was guiding on the west coast of the South Island based at a lodge there called Lake Moeraki Wilderness Lodge, which was really cool. And the specialty kind of bird there was a fiordland-crested penguin, which nest along the coastline there. So we got a lot of birders coming through specifically who wanted to see them. I think there was one lady, I can't remember her name, but she'd seen every species of penguin in the world except that one. So that was her last one. So that was really special to take her out. It's the lodge itself is in the rainforest, so there's a lot of endemic birds like kaka, which is a big parrot, kind of almost the equivalent of a cockatoo, and New Zealand fern bird in the lake nearby. So a lot of people which were really excited to see some endemic birds like that. You could tell who the really keen listers were, because there were a lot of people with a general appreciation who are happy to do a morning bird walk and just see what's around. And there are some people right, when are we seeing the penguins, kind of thing, which is
right.
And they're both great.
Absolutely, yeah. And also to loop back to what we were saying right at the beginning about seabirds and that, I'm sure that a huge chunk of the market must be for that, like pelagic birding in New Zealand. Yeah,
there is. There's potentially not as many pelagic operators as you'd expect for a pelagic bird country like New Zealand. Birding's still a relatively newish kind of hobby in New Zealand. So there are some. There's the most famous kind of public or company that does it is in Kaikoura, just north of Christchurch, and that's if there's an international bird who has only got time for one pelagic. That's often the one that is recommended. They do just a 2.5 hour trip, and even that's fantastic because they've got a really deep water canyon just off the coast, so it takes 10 minutes to get out there, and you're seeing 5 or 6 species of albatross, and you've got snow-covered mountains in the background. So that's pretty exciting.
Wow, I can imagine in my head. I can see it. Oh, incredible. I mean, I've been to New Zealand. I think how many times? Twice. But only in the North Island, and there's so much diversity between. I would argue that perhaps the birding is better in the South Island. Would you agree?
Well, as a South Islander, I'd say yes. It depends who you talk to and what you're after, but there's a lot more. There are a lot more people in the North Island. It's kind of a 3-to-1 ratio. So there's more kind of wilderness area in the South Island, which is more attractive for birding, I suppose. So yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And I suppose the North Island is also much more developed in terms of agriculture. So perhaps the habitat is more fragmented in the North Island. Is that right?
Yeah, it can be. I mean, just around Christchurch and Canterbury, it's probably the most cleared part of New Zealand. There's virtually no native bush. It's all farmland around Christchurch as you head north, south, and west away from the coast, which is not great. But and there are island endemics to both islands. So I'm sure North Island, they would tell you that North Island is better.
And which are those endemics for each island?
So there's the 2 robin species, which formerly were one species and was split. Controversially, there's the kōkako, one of our songbirds, a wattlebird.
Yeah.
The South Island one is almost certainly extinct. Unfortunately, there are occasional reports and it's officially data deficient, but there hasn't been a confirmed sighting in quite a while. But there's the North Island version of that, and then there are often subspecies which are split between the islands as well.
I love discussing because the podcast so far has been very Australia focused, and I'd like to kind of branch out maybe, and that's why I was so thrilled to have you on, and thanks for coming on again. But I know that you have been to Australia by looking at your eBird profile, and funnily enough, there's more species that you've seen in Australia than you've seen in New Zealand, but just because of the numbers. And so what? Let's talk about that a little bit. The similarities and differences between New Zealand and Australian birding. What are your thoughts on that, if any?
Yeah, there's lots of similarities being 2 countries that are so close together, and got quite a few species that cross over that are in both countries. But yeah, the first big thing would be, as you say, there's just far more in Australia. So it's about a ×3 kind of rule. We have the birders, we have the 200 club, and I think you have the 600 club in Australia.
700, I think, they say.
Is it 700? Okay. Okay, yeah, maybe I'm a bit behind the times. But yeah, I mean, our top lister has just cracked 300 birds, which is an incredible effort for New Zealand. And I think your top lister is up around the 900 mark. So it's kind of roughly equates that way.
Wow. Yeah.
there are fewer birders as well, far fewer. Like I've recently, there was a black tern, which was the first New Zealand record, which was really exciting. And there, for a first New Zealand record, there weren't that many people there. When I was there was 5 people. Came back later, and there was 1. I'm not sure how many people went for it overall, but for a first record, that's very few people.
Wow, yeah. Okay. And so about the population and people going to see these birds, these mega records, do you think the numbers of people going to see them and the number of birders is only due to the smaller population of New Zealand, or is there something else that prevents people from becoming birders in New Zealand?
I'm not sure. I think that the population definitely plays a big part, but I almost have a gut feeling that proportionally there are slightly fewer in New Zealand. I mentioned before, it's kind of a young hobby. It's growing all the time, but even I've been seriously birding for about 3 or 4 years, and in that time, I'm sure there are quite a few more birders around than even 4 years ago. And I think it kind of reflects in the attitude of the general public. Birding in Australia, walking around a park with binoculars, people come up to you and say, "Oh, I've seen cockatoos over there," or that kind of thing. But in New Zealand, you kind of get funny looks, and people go, "Oh, what are you looking at?" And you almost feel a bit guilty. And I've actually had a couple of funny stories where I'm convinced I've nearly had the police called on me.
No, really?
There was one, I was twitching some white-throated needletails up at the top of the South Island, and I was on a friend's property walking around looking for them, and my friend got a phone call saying, "Oh, I'm going to call the police. There's some weirdo with binoculars walking around your property." So it's kind of just I suppose there may be similar stories in Australia, but the public's just not quite as used to birders over here, I think.
Well, yeah, and you could say that the public in New Zealand isn't quite as used to birds either, because the birds in Australia are so big and visible everywhere, and you get and noisy. The cockatoos, the kookaburras, the currawongs, the rainbow lorikeets, all these backyard birds, so to speak. And people are excited about them. Even at my work, people come up to me and say, "Hey, guess what I had? I had this whole gang of rainbow lorikeets," and yeah, public perception of birds is very interesting, isn't it? Of the non-birders.
Yeah.
And in New Zealand, I guess what comes to my mind is the tui as a backyard bird that's quite big and popular. Yeah. But yeah, it's interesting. It's really interesting, that train of thought that the non-birders, that those stories are really funny, man. That's
yeah.
I feel you.
The places that draw parallels with New Zealand are often places like Hawaii, another isolated island chain with lots of endemic birds and unfortunately lots of extinct birds as well. So it's a kind of a good international comparison between New Zealand and Hawaii. But there are quite a few differences between Aussie and New Zealand birding. I mean, in New Zealand, you can just, if you hear an interesting bird off the path in the forest, you can just, charge off after it without much concern for your safety. But in Australia, you've potentially got be a bit more careful about what's lurking in the undergrowth, which is something to adjust to. When I've been over in Australia, I've got to kind of stop myself from going, "Oh no, hold on, I've got to check first before I stand in this waist high grass."
Yeah, wow, for sure. Like, and the fact is that snake bites or spider bites or anything, it doesn't happen often, but it only needs to happen once. So it's good to always be careful, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, wow. And going back to focus on New Zealand, what's your favorite spot for birding in New Zealand? Where do you love to go the most for birding?
Oh, it's a good question. It's hard to keep it, down to one kind of answer. I really like the west coast of the South Island as a region. It's got a really low population. There's a lot of intact forest there, so it's really good for bush birding. And there are virtually no birders live over there. So whenever I'm birding there, I really feel like there's a really good chance of finding something, a vagrant of some sort. Especially as it's the west coast, it's facing Australia, and a lot of our vagrants come from Australia, so you really feel like you're a chance there. The other places would be our we've got lots and lots of offshore islands, which we've made predator free. So the birds do really well there. And they're always really special places to go to because there's just, compared to the mainland, there's far more birds around. There's more diversity and there's more of everything. So that's really cool to see. And again, it makes it a little bit sad because you think this is what the whole country should be like, but it still makes it really, really special when you go there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I remember speaking about that when I was a kid, a little kid. I used to watch the David Attenborough Life of Birds show a lot, and when he goes to New Zealand, the episode of New Zealand are so enthralling, isn't it? Because he just talks about the moas and the takahe. And there's a sequence where he's interacting with a saddleback, all those amazing birds. Like, it blew my mind when I was a kid, and it is a bit sad to know that they're kind of restricted, and the kakapo as well, of course. And so, but it can also serve as a drive, I suppose. And it can serve to be an urgent drive, is the word, to conserve these remaining habitats, and also on the mainland. Are there pockets of the mainland where there's a very high diverse number of native birds, or is it really only on the islands?
No, there are a few on the mainland. They do these cool things called mainland islands, where they'll either do really intense predator control and or have a fenced sanctuary. So just recently, one in Wellington's become really famous and popular called Zealandia. So there's a big fenced eco sanctuary there, and kaka and kakariki, smaller native parrots, are doing really well there. And they've got kiwi and stitchbird, lots of endemics, and it's becoming normal for Wellington residents to see kaka flying around and landing in their backyard. So that's, it's not just offshore islands. There are spots on the mainland which are really good as well. But
yeah, wow, that's great. I really, and I suppose in the last 2 years with COVID and everything that's been happening, and the international birding has somewhat slowed down, I can imagine. Is that the case?
yeah, fewer international visitors. It's been a good chance for New Zealanders to get to know their birds a bit better, and there's lots of tourism opportunities and tourism adverts encouraging New Zealanders to get out and do something new. So I hope birding could be that new thing. But yeah, and even when people are stuck at home during a lockdown, looking outside, one of the more obvious things you see in your garden is birds. So it gives kind of people a new appreciation for them.
Yeah, for sure, and that loops back to the public perception of birds, which I'm really interested in that. Because what else do you see, like, in the big cities, in Wellington and in Auckland and in Christchurch? What are the garden birds? I guess you get the tui, and what are the other common ones?
Where I am in Christchurch, it's in the Canterbury Plains. I mentioned with all that cleared habitat before, it's about the only spot in the country you don't get tui. So tui's quite a cool bird for me, because it usually means I'm on holiday, because I'm away from Christchurch. But the common garden birds where I am, it's mostly introduced things. So house sparrow, blackbird, starling, song thrush. It's an exciting day when you get a fantail or a grey warbler or a bellbird, that kind of thing. But wow. I know, and I mentioned Wellington, they have a lot more native birds because of that big eco sanctuary, and like you say, in Auckland, tui is a common backyard bird.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, wow. It must be. What do you feel when you look out your window and you see all these birds that come from Europe? It must be strange, isn't it? Or is it so ingrained, I suppose, in the culture that? Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of the norm now, because I've lived in Christchurch for a lot of my life, so it's kind of, it's what I expect is normal here. But being a birder and knowing what I know, it is kind of sad that there are far fewer native birds. And as I say, I get really excited when I see a fantail in my garden, which is not an uncommon bird from over all of New Zealand, but it's just really cool to see one, and in a city kind of thing.
And when you see one of those, let's shift on to eBird and listing, because that's it's a big topic of the show, and so what's it like in New Zealand? The whole eBird phenomenon and listing. Are birders in New Zealand generally into that?
Yep, yeah. eBird in particular is growing really fast. There's a project on at the moment called the New Zealand Bird Atlas, where it's mapping distribution of birds all across New Zealand, and the portal for submitting data through that is eBird. So lots of people are doing that, and lots of people who aren't necessarily birders who just want to be part of a citizen science project. So that's really good that eBird's on the rise. And personally, I'm a big eBird fanatic and love seeing what I need to see and what my lists are at on there. There's quite a few, especially birders that have been doing it for longer in New Zealand who either don't use eBird or they just haven't backfilled a lot of their historical records. But especially increasingly, it's becoming more and more popular.
Right. And do you have LGAs as well over there, or is it by region?
Yeah, so we don't have LGAs. We have the country, and then we have regions, and then within those regions we have districts.
Right.
So the districts are the finest scale on eBird, and even in most regions in New Zealand there aren't actually districts on eBird or that you can view. So there's 4 or 5 of the regions have districts. So in Canterbury, I think there's 7 or 8 districts. So yeah.
Yeah, that's the kind of, and so when you go on your eBird map, that's what you see at the finer level, is it?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. And so talk to me about how you first started that and what drove you to kind of start listing more seriously and eBirding more seriously. Was it quite gradual, or did you kind of get into it in overnight sort of thing?
Yeah, I'd always been interested in birds, but I'd never really kept a New Zealand list. I'd been on a few family holidays to Australia, and I'd always kept lists of what I'd seen there, but I just, for whatever reason, didn't do it in New Zealand. And then I started a new job at Department of Conservation 4 years ago and had a workmate who was a really keen lister. And so he kind of gave me the bug, and I really got into listing then, and downloaded the checklist and saw and ticked off everything what I'd seen. And then it was all my spare time I was going on little trips trying to fill out the checklist, and it just went from there. Now I'm at the point where I'm chasing vagrants all the time. So it's a vicious disease.
yeah, and it's pretty contagious too, isn't it? Like when you talk about it to people, like they're always like, oh, interesting. Like what, especially looping back once again to non-birders, I say, yeah, I keep a list. I've got this app, check it out, and you see all the lists. It's really kind of a complete picture of the passion in some sense. And it allows you to keep track of also what you need, what birds you're missing.
Yeah.
Which I love. I'm subscribed to the eBird alerts, and it's and the needs alerts. And do you have those activated? And which birds do you still need for New Zealand?
yeah, I've got those activated. Just the other day, I had one come through for a chestnut teal, an Australian bird, which is a vagrant to New Zealand, and got back from twitching that 2 nights ago, which was great. Which came through eBird alerts. In terms of New Zealand birds, there's not too many I need left. There are a couple within the country. We've got quite a few far-flung island groups, and they've all got their own endemic birds. So sub-Antarctic islands and the Chatham Islands, and there are a few birds from those that I still need. But apart from those kind of island endemics, the one bird which I haven't seen yet in New Zealand is a Pomeranian skewer.
Oh.
So that we get those, and there's some around every year, but I've only bumped into Arctics and longtails so far, so that's one that's avoiding me at the moment.
Wow, fantastic! Wow, so you've seen like all the iconic land birds, like I dream of seeing like things like blue duck and black stilt and all those crazy birds, man. Wow.
Yeah, those are all awesome birds. So just recently, you might be able to see my shirt here, got back from volunteering on Codfish Island, Whenua, and seeing kakapo, which was an amazing experience, and yeah, all the kiwi, that kind of thing. So I feel quite lucky to have been able to see a really large chunk of the awesome endemic birds we have here.
How to plan a trip to New Zealand for birding is one of the topics that we had, and I think it would be interesting maybe if you could give a few tips. Say, if you had a week or 2 weeks to go birding in New Zealand, how would you recommend someone does it?
Yeah, it's a really good question because it depends what you're after. If you're after just to see the most possible, or you might be really interested in a couple of target species. So you might really want to see kiwi, so your trip might revolve around that. But for the general birder, I'd say include at least one pelagic for sure. Whether it's that Kaikoura one I mentioned, or there's one running up in Northland at the moment out of Tutakaka, near about an hour and a half, 2 hours north of Auckland, which is really good. So either of those would be fantastic. And then a good way to do it is just eBird as well, with its species maps and things. And people are pretty good at logging their sightings. But yeah, I would probably recommend going around maybe Auckland, where there's a couple of those predator-free offshore islands. There's one called Tiri Mātangi, which is quite a famous one, and I've got kiwi and takahe and kokako on there, and that's even internationally that's quite a famous one. I know. I think Noah Stryker, when he was doing his big year, went to Tiri, so it's had some celebrities there. But yeah, there are lots of ways of doing a trip in New Zealand.
Yeah, it does depend completely on what you're after and what type of birds you want to get. Because some birders are definitely, and we all lean in one way or another on a certain type of birding. There's the pelagic tragics, as they say. The land, I quite like land birding. But as I say, yesterday on that pelagic, I was just because I hadn't been on a pelagic for like a couple of years. Last one was off the coast of Chile, actually.
Oh wow!
Because I lived there for a bit. But yeah, just rediscovering that, and you're just thrust into the environment. It's so mind blowing, and that's a great birding talking point about New Zealand is the pelagic birding again. Just so cool, so cool.
Yeah, it's really cool over here. As I mentioned, it's getting more popular, and there are new trips kind of springing up around the place all the time. And yeah, there's just so many species that can possibly arrive, and it goes back to that joy of birding, especially here in New Zealand. Wherever you're doing a pelagic, there's almost certainly going to be something of interest, which is really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose the lack of pelagics, because you mentioned that there weren't as many as one would think, and so I think if it kind of kicks off a bit more and that more trips start popping up, you'd start to get really valuable data on seabirds, because like it must be like with all the subantarctic islands down there, and you'd get new distribution patterns and stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
And
yeah, that the west coast, which I keep mentioning, which is a bit of a favourite of mine, there are along basically the whole west coast of the South Island, there are no pelagic operators. You either have to be part of sometimes a big heritage expedition, which might go up around Fiordland, or get in touch with a fishing company, and even the fishing charters there are relatively limited. So I know someone recently who just got in touch with a boat that's going out fishing for the day and just paid them to be on board and stand as a casual observer, basically, and be involved that way.
Yeah, that's awesome, and that's how those things. And then the fishing charter people also, if it happens often enough, they start to see the economic benefit of doing pelagic trips. I suppose that's also the other thing, that it's a two-way thing. It's not just about the birders, but also about the fishermen and the people who operate the boats and the machinery and all of that. So there's that's a great point, actually, because the same thing happened here. Just briefly, on the pelagic I went yesterday, it's off Southwest Rocks, which is on the mid-north coast. It's about 5 or 6 hours north of Sydney, something like that. And so there's this whole gap, and Liam Murphy knows about this. He's the one that organised it, and he was on the show a few episodes ago, and so he organised a pelagic that goes out of Southwest Rocks, because there wasn't anything in that region of ocean. And that's so thrilling, because, like, you know, the idea of going out on a pelagic where, you know, there aren't many pelagics that go out. It's just the potential to see what could be there, because it's been underexplored, and I'm sure you're familiar with that, you know, and that must be exciting definitely to go on a pelagic when off New Zealand, where you wouldn't normally go as often. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that just reminds me of a trip I went on in April last year. There were about 13 of us really keen birders. We went on a 12, 13-day cruise up from the North Island up to the Kermadec Islands, up northeast of New Zealand. That's a really underbirded part of there's very little seabirding that goes on there. So we were really hoping for some mega birds, and we got a couple. We got the 4th or 5th record of red-footed booby for New Zealand, and about 40 or 50 greater frigate birds. And probably the bird of the trip was a collared petrel, magnificent petrel, with the grey wash on the front. So that kept pretty much everyone on board pretty happy, I think.
Yeah, fabulous. There's something about seabirds, yeah, for sure, that just fascinate the soul, I suppose.
Yeah.
But and so moving on to the closing questions. So I'd like to make this a two-part question. Do you have a favorite New Zealand bird, and then zooming out from that, a favorite international bird?
Yeah. New Zealand is probably the North Island ecological, that wattle bird I mentioned before. When I was 10, my family went to Matangi, that island off the North Island, and I just vividly remember one morning, in the pre-dawn light, there were about 8 people standing on this boardwalk, just listening to this pair of ecological duetting with each other, and it was just fantastic. I've got this incredible haunting organ-like song, and it's really special, and that's one of my favourite birding memories. So that'll be my favourite New Zealand bird. And then expanding out, I don't know, I find it a wee bit tricky to say something's my favourite bird if I haven't seen it. But in Australia, my favourite bird I've seen is probably chestnut rail up in Darwin.
Wow.
Just because that was one that it took a lot of work to see, a lot of hours put in skulking around in mangroves and things. So I really enjoy a bird sighting when I've had to put in a lot of work for it. So that was pretty cool.
Absolutely, yeah. The chestnut rail's notoriously quite a difficult one, isn't it? And the climate makes it even harder. The humidity and the environment. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Where did you go in Australia and how many times have you been?
I've probably been 5 or 6 times, but only the most recent 2 were specifically birding trips. The first 4 or 5 times were family holidays, and I managed to do a wee bit of birding on those, but places like Daintree Rainforest up northeast Queensland, which is an awesome spot. We did a camper van trip around southwest Western Australia, and my mum has family in the Central Coast, so we've been there a couple of times. And then more recently I did a birding trip where I went to Melbourne for 2 weeks and spent a week up in Chiltern, in North Victoria, which was really cool. And then where I saw the chestnut rail, did 2 weeks doing Darwin and Kakadu, and went down to Pine Creek for Gouldy and Finch. So a couple of weeks up there, which was really exciting.
Oh, fantastic! That's really cool that you get to do that. Do New Zealand birders often do that? Like, is it a thing in the New Zealand birding world to okay, I'm going to Australia for 3 weeks and then I'm coming back, like, sort of thing?
Yeah, it's quite a popular thing because it's quite relatively similar cultures and ways of birding, and it's quite a an easy transition, just an easy access to hop over there and do that, and it's attractive with so many more bird species you have. But I do know I've got a friend who's doing a big year in Australia at the moment. He's been a New Zealand birder all his life, and he's just with his partner tripping around Aussie for a year. His goal's 600, and I think he'll get it.
Do birders do that a lot? Like, go around the whole kind of the whole country and do that sort of thing, or is it less popular? They still do it?
Yeah, no, it happens. It's probably the lap of Australia is probably a bit more popular because New Zealand's, geographically a lot smaller, so it doesn't take quite as long to get all around. But there's a tour company called Ribble Birds, which does tours. They do a 21-day tour, which is basically a big lap of the country, and they see a really good number of the endemic species. And just in the last couple of years, big year birding has gotten quite a lot more popular in New Zealand. So the record was broken last year by a guy called Dave Howes, who got 250, which is the record now. And Harry Borman also broke the record that year and got 246. So two guys both breaking the record of the same year was pretty cool. And yeah, it was the first time there'd been a premeditated, properly planned out big year. In the past, it had been the previous record was someone, I think, a couple months in going, I'm going really well here. All right, I'll do a big year. But this is the first kind of premeditated crack at it.
Yeah, wow, interesting. Yeah, that's a really good. I love big years. They're a great part of birding as well. I've never done one. You got to choose a year specifically. You got to be careful about how you choose it, because then if you start committing to it, it would be depressing to kind of say, all right, I didn't choose the right year to do this. Maybe I'll do it next year, sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And just this last year, in New Zealand, we've had a fantastic summer for vagrants. So last year and this year would have been great years to do big years.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. And something I just wanted to mention also, because I had to. I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan, right? And the scenery, famously is from New Zealand. They went to New Zealand to film that, and that's a huge aspect of the international tourism scene in New Zealand. The scenery itself. That's that's a bonus for birders, of course, to see this magnificent scenery. It's absolutely mind blowing. I just wanted to throw that out there.
No, absolutely, yeah. That's part of why I love the West Coast, which I keep bringing up, because it's kind of it's a really rugged spot, and mountains down to the sea and forests and wild beaches and things, and you've got Fiordland just south, which is that classic rugged tourist spot. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah,
just beautiful, isn't it? Yeah. And do you have as the closing question, do you have a dream destination that you've always, maybe not always, but that at the moment you're really keen to visit for birds anywhere in the world? Where would it be?
Yeah, for sure. Probably it's Central or South America for me. It's kind of always the bird watchers. It's like the place to go for the number of species, and it's kind of been something I've been looking at for so long. I've watched countless documentaries about the Amazon rainforest and that kind of thing. So go there and see a harpy eagle would probably be the absolute dream for me.
For sure, yeah. So many possibilities. Just as a side note, I lived in French Guiana, which is
oh wow.
Yeah, I was born in France, so I have a French passport. And I spent, in 2016, I went to French Guiana, which is just north of Brazil. It's an overseas French department. And that's pure Amazon jungle. And they do get harpies there, but I didn't see one.
Damn. You'll have to go back.
Have to go back, yeah. We'll go together and try and get it.
Sounds good.
But it's been an absolute pleasure, Fraser. Thank you so much for your time. It's really cool to have an international guest, and I hope to have more international guests in the future. But you've been a pleasure. So thanks.
No, thanks so much for having me on. It's been great fun.
Thanks very much. All right, happy birding. See you soon.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to or watching this episode of the Birding Today podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to stay up to date with the show, you can follow me on all my social media platforms. And if you want to take it a step further and support the show and also get some cool benefits, you can support me on Patreon as well. So again, thank you for listening or watching, and I'll see you in the next one.